The officers, the department, and the city had been changed by a single moment, a moment when assumptions were shattered, when biases were confronted, and when the power of seeing people for who they truly were began to take hold. And in the end, that moment had led to something greater than anyone had imagined, a future where growth, understanding, and leadership were not just ideals, but realities. As Adira stepped out into the evening air, surrounded by her team, she smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. She had shown them the power of change, and now, they would carry it forward. The life lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of perseverance, of confronting your own biases, and of leading with integrity. Change, though difficult, was always possible. And it was always worth it. Officers who had once been reluctant to engage with the community now stood shoulder to shoulder with citizens, working together to build stronger relationships. There was a newfound trust in the air, a trust that hadn't existed before, not in the same way. And it wasn't just the community that had changed, it was the department itself. Adira stood by the window of her office, looking out at the officers mingling with the people they had sworn to protect. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, knowing that change was possible, even when others had told her it was impossible. But now, as she watched the officers work together, she realized that the real change wasn't just in the policies, or the programs, or the outreach. It was in the hearts and minds of the officers, in the way they saw each other and the way they saw themselves. And that change, the most powerful kind of transformation, had come from within. Malik and Hughes, who had once been skeptical, now looked at their chief with deep respect, a respect that went beyond her title or her rank. They had learned the value of seeing people for who they truly were, of recognizing the strength that existed in those they had once underestimated. They had learned that leadership wasn't about authority, it was about integrity. It was about inspiring those around you to be their best, not by forcing compliance, but by leading with example. It had taken a single moment, an unexpected encounter during a routine traffic stop, for them to realize that the chief they had pulled over was someone far greater than they had ever imagined. And that lesson, the lesson of looking beyond the surface, had reshaped their entire approach to leadership, to justice, and to their work. Adira had taught them, not through speeches or directives, but through her actions, that leadership was not about being above others, it was about lifting them up. She had shown them the power of perseverance, the importance of self-awareness, and the undeniable impact of inspiring change, no matter how impossible it seemed at first. As the officers filed out of the community event, their faces lit with genuine smiles, Adira took a moment to reflect on her journey. She had started with nothing but a belief that she could make a difference, that she could rise above the prejudice, the barriers, and the doubts others had placed before her. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick, but she had persevered. She had learned, grown, and adapted to become the leader she had always known she could be. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the city, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She knew that the journey wasn't over, that the road ahead would still hold challenges and obstacles. But she also knew that as long as she kept leading with integrity, with compassion, and with the strength to stand for what was right, change would continue to ripple outward. One afternoon, as the department prepared for a major public event, Adira took a moment to address the officers. The room was filled with the hum of anticipation, and despite the progress, there was still a palpable sense of uncertainty. But when Adira spoke, her words settled over the room like a calm breeze. "Look, we've come a long way," she said, her voice steady, "but we're not done yet. The work we're doing here, it matters. It matters to this city, to the people we serve, and it matters to each other. We're here to build trust, not just with the public, but with each other. And that starts with respecting one another, no matter what. I'm proud of how far we've come, but I'm more proud of how we're growing. That's what matters." There was a pause, and for the first time in a long while, the officers looked at her, not just as their chief, but as a leader who had earned their trust. It wasn't because of the badge she wore, or the rank she held. It was because of who she was, someone who had proven herself through actions, not words. In the weeks that followed, the changes became more evident. Officers who had once resisted Adira's leadership now approached her for advice, for guidance, even for support. The department began to feel more cohesive, more united in its mission. There was still work to be done, but there was a sense of optimism in the air that had never existed before. And as the officers looked toward the future, they knew that the transformation they had witnessed wasn't just about the department, it was about themselves, too. They had seen their own biases and assumptions challenged, and they had come out the other side stronger, more united, and more committed to the ideals of justice and fairness. In the end, it was clear that the unexpected encounter during the traffic stop had sparked something much greater than anyone could have anticipated. It had started a chain of events that had led to growth, adaptation, and resilience. And as Adira Grant continued to lead, the officers followed, not out of obligation, but out of respect for the strength, wisdom, and dedication to justice she had shown them all. The department was different now, but it was better. And they had come to realize that change, though never easy, was always worth it. The transformation within the department had been remarkable. What began as an uncomfortable and tense moment on a quiet street had sparked a journey that no one could have predicted, not for Chief Adira Grant, not for her officers, and not for the entire department. The road had been long, filled with challenges, resistance, and moments of doubt, but it had also been filled with growth, change, and the power of seeing things with new eyes. It was a rainy afternoon when the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The department had just wrapped up a successful community outreach program, one of the many initiatives Adira had pushed forward. Whether it was handling a difficult case, mediating a dispute between officers, or simply taking the time to listen, Adira's actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Her first major reform was to address the underlying tension within the department. She knew that the years of unspoken biases and fractured relationships couldn't be fixed overnight, but she also knew that something needed to change. She began with listening sessions, small meetings with officers of all ranks, where they could speak openly about their concerns, their frustrations, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't an easy process. Many officers were reluctant at first, unsure whether they could be honest in a room with their new chief. But Adira's approach was gentle, her manner open, and it didn't take long for them to realize that she was genuinely there to hear them, not judge them. Through these sessions, Adira learned more about the deep-rooted issues within the department, problems that had long been ignored or swept under the rug. But instead of coming down hard on the officers for their shortcomings, she focused on finding solutions, creating programs and training that emphasized empathy, understanding, and teamwork. Slowly but surely, officers began to recognize the value in her leadership style. They realized that Adira wasn't here to break them down, she was here to build them up. It wasn't without its struggles, though. There were moments of tension when old habits died hard, when some officers questioned her decisions or resisted her reforms. But Adira faced these challenges with unwavering calm, never rushing to anger or frustration. She understood that change was uncomfortable, especially for those who had grown used to the old ways. But her patience and consistency paid off, and over time, even the most resistant officers began to see the benefits of her leadership. Malik, who had been one of the first to misjudge Adira, now found himself looking up to her in a way he never expected. He had watched her confront difficult situations with wisdom and fairness, never once compromising her principles. When a controversial case came to light involving an officer's misconduct, Adira handled it with remarkable transparency. She didn't shy away from the difficult truths, and she didn't protect anyone for the sake of the department's reputation. She acted with integrity, showing her team that justice meant doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. Hughes, too, had come to respect her in ways he hadn't thought possible. He had always viewed leadership as a position of authority, a place where one had to command respect. But with Adira, he saw that true respect was earned through action and consistency. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it meant standing alone. He had watched her take on the department's most challenging issues, one by one, and handle them with a quiet strength that spoke volumes. Both reflecting on how they had come to know Adira not as the figurehead they once thought her to be, but as a leader who carried with her a history of struggle, strength, and undeniable resilience. And as they sat there, they both realized something fundamental. This was the leadership they had been waiting for. It was different, yes, but it was exactly what the department needed. For Adira, the transition wasn't without its challenges. She had spent years working to earn the respect of her peers, and she knew that many of them still carried the remnants of outdated views. But she also knew that change couldn't be forced, it had to be earned. With each passing day, she led by example, showing her team that respect wasn't something you demanded, but something you built together, brick by brick. One afternoon, she called a department-wide meeting, a chance for everyone to come together, not just as officers, but as individuals. The room was filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope, officers who weren't sure what to expect, but who sensed the winds of change in the air. Adira stood at the front, calm and composed, but there was a warmth in her presence that immediately put the room at ease. "We're at a turning point," she began, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's not just about new policies or strategies. It's about us, as a department, coming together to support each other. Leadership isn't about being on top, it's about lifting others up. And I'm here to lift every single one of you." There was a quiet hum of agreement in the room, and for the first time, it wasn't just about what Adira was saying, it was about what was being felt. A new energy was taking root, and for the first time in a long while, the officers felt something they hadn't realized they were missing: hope. It was clear that this change was just beginning. The journey ahead would be long, filled with both setbacks and triumphs. But as the officers filed out of the meeting, there was a sense of optimism in the air, a shared belief that, under Adira's guidance, the department was evolving into something better, something more united. The road to transformation was never smooth, but with the right leadership, anything was possible. Under Chief Adira Grant's leadership, the department began to change in ways no one had expected. The shift was subtle at first, small adjustments here and there, but over time, those changes grew, becoming the foundation of a new era for the department. It wasn't just about new policies or procedures. It was about a transformation in the very way they viewed each other, their work, and the role of leadership itself. The officers, once uncertain of their new chief, now found themselves following her example. They watched her as she moved through the department, addressing each situation with poise and confidence. She wasn't the type to lecture or dictate from the top, instead, she led by doing. An abstract concept that belonged to those higher up in the chain. Under Adira's guidance, leadership felt immediate, personal, and, dare they admit it, human. She didn't just bark orders from behind a desk, she was present, approachable, and above all, understanding. It wasn't long before her leadership style began to seep into the fabric of the department, shifting the way things were done. Hughes, who had once been skeptical, now found himself actively seeking out the chief's advice. At first, it had been a reluctant adjustment, but now there was a quiet respect in his actions. He noticed the subtle yet powerful way she connected with the officers, taking the time to listen to their concerns, offering support where it was needed. She didn't lead with force, she led with empathy, guiding her team not through fear, but through trust. Malik, too, felt the change. He had spent so many years believing that the louder the authority, the more powerful it was. But Adira had shown him that true leadership wasn't about volume, it was about clarity, about forging a connection with those you led. He had seen her in action during a meeting, not as a figurehead but as a partner, working with her officers to solve problems, offering solutions, and empowering them to do their best work. She wasn't just the person in charge, she was the person they could count on. Still, change was never easy. Old habits died hard, and some officers were struggling to adapt. A few resisted, clinging to the old ways they had grown comfortable with. The shift wasn't immediate, and there were bumps along the way, unspoken doubts, and lingering biases that hadn't fully been addressed. But beneath the surface, there was an undeniable undercurrent of transformation, one that couldn't be ignored for long. In the break room one afternoon, Malik and Hughes sat together, the weight of the recent weeks on their shoulders. The change in the department was palpable, but it wasn't just the department that was evolving, it was them, too. "You know," Hughes started, his voice thoughtful, I wasn't sure how this was gonna go, especially after everything that happened with that stop. But I've got to admit, she's been impressive. Never thought I'd see a woman like her in this position, not with the way things have always been. Malik nodded, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. I get it. But I think we were wrong about her. I think we were wrong about a lot of things. She's not like the other chiefs, the ones who were just about making sure everyone followed the rules. She listens. She understands. And that makes all the difference. Hughes paused, his fingers tapping the table lightly. Yeah, but it's not just that, is it? It's her whole approach. She doesn't let anyone forget that leadership is about more than just power. It's about connection, about empathy. The two men sat in silence for a moment. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness. Only the quiet strength of a woman who had been pushed to the limit, yet had never given up. I've lost a lot, she continued, my friends, my family at times, because I was so focused on getting to the top. There were nights when I didn't sleep, when I doubted whether it was all worth it. But every step I took, every door that closed, I kept telling myself, this is for something bigger. This is for everyone who's been told they couldn't be a part of this. The weight of her words settled over Malik and Hughes like a heavy blanket. They had never asked about her journey before, never thought to. But now, in this quiet moment, they understood. They understood what it had taken for her to get here, the unseen sacrifices, the strength required to keep going when the world seemed to say no at every turn. Malik's voice was quieter now, more reflective. I didn't know, he said softly. I had no idea what you'd been through to get here. Adira gave him a small, knowing smile, her eyes softening. Most people don't, she replied. But that's okay. Not everyone has to understand. What matters is that I did it. And I'm here. Now, we all have a chance to do better. The silence stretched between them, but this time, it was filled with something new, respect, understanding, and a sense of shared purpose that hadn't been there before. They were no longer just officers in the department, standing under the weight of a new authority figure. They were seeing a woman who had fought for every inch of her place in this world, and in doing so, had become more than just a leader. She had become a symbol of what it meant to overcome, to persist, and to never give up. For the first time that night, Malik and Hughes both saw Adira Grant not as their boss, but as a person with her own battles, her own story. And as they stood there, the realization settled deep inside them, this was the woman they would follow. This was the woman who had earned their respect, not just because of her position, but because of the strength, heart, and perseverance she had shown to get there. The days following the unexpected traffic stop were marked by a subtle but undeniable shift in the department's atmosphere. The incident had created ripples that reached far beyond the quiet corner of the city where it had first unfolded. It wasn't just about the misunderstanding on the street, it was about something deeper, a transformation in how the officers viewed authority, leadership, and each other. The presence of Chief Adira Grant had altered the course of their work, their relationships, and, perhaps most importantly, their perceptions. At roll call each morning, there was an unfamiliar energy in the room. Officers stood a little taller, spoke a little more respectfully, and looked at their new chief with a renewed sense of awareness. Gone were the days when leadership felt distant. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as the tension from earlier began to fade, but something deeper lingered in the air, an unspoken understanding that now hung between them. The moment was quiet, almost intimate, as the officers stood in the stillness of the night, processing the weight of what had just unfolded. The woman who had been nothing more than a subject of their questioning just moments ago was now revealed to be their new chief. But beyond the authority she wielded, Malik and Hughes were beginning to see a person, someone whose journey was far from easy, someone who had faced hardships that neither of them had fully understood until now. It was Malik who broke the silence, his voice a little quieter than before, as if hesitant to disturb the fragile atmosphere that had settled over them. Chief, I don't know what to say, he began, his eyes a little softer now, his earlier discomfort giving way to something more genuine. I didn't expect this. I didn't realize what you'd gone through to get here. Adira looked at him for a moment, her face calm, but the faintest flicker of something deeper passed through her eyes, something raw. She took a breath, almost as though she were preparing to share something personal, something not many had ever heard. I've had to fight for everything, she said, her voice quieter now. The sharpness of her authority softened, revealing the woman behind the uniform. People don't always see that. They don't see the late nights, the sacrifices. They don't see the doors that were slammed in my face before I could even knock. Malik felt a shift in his chest, a heaviness that came not just from the realization of her struggles but from the deep empathy that began to well up inside him. He had been so focused on the job, on the rules, that he hadn't stopped to consider the kind of strength it took to make it to the place where Adira now stood. Hughes, standing nearby, stepped closer, drawn in by her words, though he remained silent. He, too, was beginning to see her not as a figurehead, but as a woman who had carried the weight of her journey every step of the way. They were learning something new about their chief, something far beyond her position or her accomplishments. They were learning about the personal cost of those achievements. Adira continued, her voice steady but carrying a weight of experience. There were days when I felt like I didn't belong. There were days when I doubted myself, when I thought I couldn't keep going. But then I remembered why I started. It wasn't just for me, it was for everyone who looked like me, for the people who never had a chance, for the ones who were told they couldn't do it, just because of who they are. She paused, and for the first time, both Malik and Hughes saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the traces of those struggles that hadn't been erased, only buried under years of resilience. Because if I didn't, no one else would. If I didn't stand up, who would? The officers absorbed her words in silence, the gravity of her journey slowly sinking in. There was no magic formula, no shortcut to success. It was all hard work, perseverance, and an unyielding belief that she had earned her place. Malik's thoughts turned inward, a quiet self-reflection beginning to take root. How many times had he dismissed someone simply because they didn't fit his idea of what leadership should look like? How many times had he assumed that authority had to look a certain way, feel a certain way? And now, standing before him was a woman who had proven all of that wrong, who had defied every stereotype, every assumption, and had risen to the highest level of leadership in their department. Hughes, too, felt a shift within him, a quiet understanding that things were changing, not just in the department, but in himself. The world he had known, the one where leadership looked like something specific, something he could recognize and understand, was no longer the world he had to operate in. Chief Grant had shown him that. For the first time in their careers, Malik and Hughes were seeing authority through a new lens, through the eyes of a woman who had spent her life breaking down the barriers that stood in her way. And in that moment, they both knew that their perceptions of leadership, of authority, of what it meant to lead, would never be the same again. Adira's calm, steady presence was no longer just a symbol of her position, it was a symbol of a new chapter, not just for the department, but for them as individuals. They could either adapt to this change, or they could be left behind. And as the tension melted away, replaced by the uneasy but undeniable respect they now held for her, both officers knew that they would never forget this encounter. It was more than just a police stop. Had he truly questioned her when she was, in fact, the one about to lead them? Chief Grant, I didn't realize, Hughes began, but he stopped himself. Words failed him. It was hard to process the full weight of the moment. He'd seen his fair share of promotions, leadership changes, and power shifts over the years, but none had hit quite like this. Adira met their stunned gazes with a quiet grace, as if she had anticipated their reactions. Her face was still calm, but her eyes betrayed a depth of understanding that was impossible to ignore. She had been in their shoes once, uncertain and unsure of the woman who now sat in front of them. She had seen the undercurrents of doubt, of prejudice, that lingered in the department. And now, she could feel it in the air again, the tension, the discomfort, the realization of the power dynamics shifting right before their eyes. Malik swallowed hard, his mind still reeling. He had been so quick to judge, so quick to treat her like just another civilian he had to deal with. His instinct had been to assert authority over her, to control the situation, not realizing that she had been the one in control all along. She was the one with the power here, and in that moment, it felt like a slap to his pride. "I'm sorry, Chief," Malik finally said, his voice quieter now, laced with a humility he wasn't used to showing. "I didn't know. I should have recognized you sooner." Adira's response was measured, her voice soft, but firm. "It's all right, Malik. I'm used to it." The words stung, but not in a way that Malik had expected. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger. Just the faintest trace of weariness that told him how many times she'd had to endure this kind of ignorance. It was the weariness of someone who had spent her life proving that she deserved to be in a place where she was constantly questioned, constantly underestimated. Hughes shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. He had always prided himself on being aware of the shifting tides of leadership. But this? This was different. He had always assumed that the people who made it to the top, who earned positions of authority, were somehow other, somehow different from the ones he worked alongside. But Chief Grant had shattered that illusion. She wasn't other. She was just like them. And yet, she had done things none of them could have imagined. How did you get here?" Hughes asked quietly, his voice tinged with both admiration and awe. He wasn't sure what he was asking. Maybe it was about her career, or maybe it was about the strength it took to reach such heights. But the question hung there, an invitation to share her story. Adira took a moment before answering, her eyes softening as she spoke. "I got here by being persistent. By not letting the roadblocks stop me. There were days when I felt like I couldn't keep going, like I was never going to get the respect I deserved. But I kept going." As the weight of the moment settled over them, a strange shift occurred. The tension between the officers and Adira Grant began to dissolve, replaced by something more profound, respect. Malik's heart pounded as he looked at her again, this time with a new awareness. She wasn't just a woman of authority, she was a symbol of progress, of a fight won. And it was in this moment, as their eyes locked, that the officers began to understand the depth of her journey. Adira's gaze remained steady, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now. She hadn't reacted to their questions or commands, because she knew she didn't have to prove anything to them. She had already proven it, time and time again. In a world that had tried to silence her, she had only grown stronger. Hughes looked at Malik, his expression a mix of disbelief and something else, regret. Recognition? Both men, seasoned officers in their own right, found themselves facing the weight of their own biases. They had both assumed something about this woman from the moment she didn't react in the way they expected. They had underestimated her. And in doing so, they had shown a side of themselves they weren't proud of. They had judged her before they had ever truly seen her. "Chief Grant," Malik said slowly, his voice a mix of awe and respect. The title now felt real, far more than just an announcement he'd skimmed over in the department newsletter. It was real, and it was undeniable. He cleared his throat, his voice steadying. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." Adira nodded, the corner of her mouth curling into a faint, knowing smile. "It's all right," she said. "You were just doing your job." But in that moment, both officers knew that they weren't just apologizing for a simple mistake. They were acknowledging the new reality they now had to face. This wasn't just about a change in leadership. It was about a shift in perspective, a reckoning with their own assumptions and prejudices. And they knew, with a heavy heart, that they would need to adapt, to grow, and to earn the respect that now belonged to someone else entirely. Adira Grant wasn't just the new chief. She was the future. And it was a future they would have to navigate with new eyes open to the possibilities of a world they had long overlooked. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence, deep, uncomfortable silence. The realization that had struck Malik and Hughes reverberated in the air like a powerful echo, changing the very dynamic of their interaction with Adira Grant. They had just pulled over their new chief. Their new chief. A woman they hadn't even recognized, despite the fact that her name had been plastered all over the department's recent announcements. Malik shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing with embarrassment. His heart raced as he replayed the entire interaction in his mind. Had he really just asked her to step out of the car? Waiting for them to realize the significance of this encounter. The silence lingered between them, thick and heavy, as Malik and Hughes stood on either side of the woman's car. The tension was palpable, as if the very air held its breath. Malik's thoughts swirled, trying to piece together the strange unease that had settled in his chest. There was something about this woman that didn't sit right with him, but it wasn't until Hughes glanced at the documents in his hand that the realization hit. Hughes, always the more experienced officer, had spent years in the department, and he was used to recognizing names and faces. He'd seen his fair share of announcements, new recruits, promotions, and leadership changes, but this was different. As his eyes scanned the papers Malik had handed him, something familiar about the name Adira Grant suddenly clicked. The name was all over the department's recent announcements. The word had spread like wildfire, stirring conversations among officers, both excited and skeptical about the new chief. But it wasn't until now, standing in front of the woman who had not flinched under their questioning, that the full weight of it hit him. "Wait a second," Hughes muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes widened in disbelief as the pieces finally fell into place. Adira Grant, she's the new chief, isn't she? Malik turned sharply, his brow furrowing as the name echoed in his mind. Adira Grant. He hadn't made the connection earlier, hadn't put it together, but the name was there, prominent in the department's recent communications. First black female police chief. He'd read it on the department's bulletin board just last week, but in his mind, that announcement had been just another piece of information to gloss over. His stomach dropped as the truth settled in. The woman who had been so still, so unflinching, in the face of their questioning was no ordinary civilian. She wasn't just some random driver. She was the one they'd all heard about, the one who had defied all odds to make history. The one who had worked tirelessly to climb the ranks, earning respect through sheer determination. The one who had fought for a place in a department that hadn't always been welcoming to her. It wasn't just a promotion she'd earned. It was a triumph over years of hardship, of prejudice, of systemic barriers. This was a woman who had shattered ceilings, a black woman who had spent her life proving that she belonged. And now, here she was, the very person who would soon be overseeing their every move. For a moment, the realization hung in the air, thick with a mixture of awe, shock, and something else, guilt. Malik couldn't help but reflect on the way they had treated her. He had asked her to step out of the car. He had questioned her calmness, his suspicion growing, unaware that the very person he had been questioning was about to become his superior. Would not be met with open arms. Early on, she had been relegated to the background, dismissed by some of her peers, overlooked by many others. There were those who made it clear that they didn't think she belonged, that a woman, especially one of her background, had no place in law enforcement. But Adira was no stranger to adversity. From an early age, she had learned how to navigate through a world that often viewed her as less than. Raised in a rough neighborhood, her mother had taught her the value of resilience, of never letting anyone define her. It was these lessons that had driven Adira to push through the barriers that were placed before her. Her rise was slow, but it was steady. Each promotion, each award, each step forward was met with resistance, but it only fueled her determination. Adira proved herself time and time again, earning the respect of her peers not through force, but through integrity, dedication, and an unshakable belief in justice. It was this unwavering commitment that eventually led her to the position of deputy chief, an achievement that had sent shockwaves through the department. But even then, the challenges didn't stop. It wasn't enough to simply rise through the ranks. She had to navigate the toxic undercurrents of institutional racism that still lingered in the force. She had to fight for her place in a system that didn't always want her to succeed. But each battle, each struggle only made her stronger, more determined to reshape the future of the department she had dedicated herself to. As she sat in her car now, waiting for the officers to figure out who she was, Adira reflected on how far she'd come. The journey had not been easy, There had been days when she wanted to quit, moments when she wondered if it was worth the toll it took on her. But now, as the newly appointed police chief, Adira could look back with pride at the path she had forged. Every challenge had led to this moment. Every sleepless night, every battle for respect, had culminated in the power she now held. Back on the street, Malik and Hughes were still trying to make sense of their interaction with her. They had no idea who she was or the strength she embodied. They couldn't see the years of struggle, the quiet victories, the battles won in the face of adversity. They didn't know that the woman sitting so calmly in the driver's seat had just been appointed their new chief. The weight of that revelation was lost on them for now. But the connection was undeniable. The woman they were questioning, the woman whose unshakable calmness was unsettling them, was the very person they would soon answer to. Her quiet authority wasn't a coincidence, it was a product of years of perseverance, of walking a difficult path that led her to this very moment. And as they stood there, still oblivious, they had no idea that the woman who had defied the odds to become the first black female police chief was now sitting just a few feet away. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping out of the vehicle so we can talk further?" She didn't resist, but her response was as calm as ever. "I'm afraid I can't do that. I'm already being very cooperative." The words, though polite, felt like a firm barrier, one that both officers instinctively recognized. Something about the woman's cool composure made them question their next steps. Malik's hand tightened around the ticket book, but his mind was racing. What was it about her that kept him on edge? For a fleeting moment, the idea crossed his mind that perhaps she wasn't just some ordinary person. There was something about her manner, something about the way she carried herself, that suggested she had power beyond his understanding. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just someone he could easily control. But still, he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The woman's steady gaze never wavered, and the silence between them stretched on, like an invisible thread pulling them closer. Malik and Hughes were trained to handle a variety of situations, but neither could have anticipated the emotional weight of this encounter. They both knew they were on the verge of something significant, but neither of them could have guessed just how deep this woman's presence would cut into their lives. The tension in the air was thick with unspoken questions, a sense of mystery, and an emotional pull that neither officer could explain. They had no idea who she was, but they were beginning to suspect she was no one they should take lightly. As the seconds ticked by in the tense stillness of the night, Officer Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman's unyielding composure only added to the growing suspicion in his gut. Who was she? How had she managed to stay so calm when everything about this situation seemed to be spiraling into unknown territory? His mind raced through possible scenarios, none of which seemed to make sense. Meanwhile, the woman sat quietly in the car, as if nothing was out of the ordinary, her hands resting lightly in her lap. But beneath the surface of her calm exterior was a woman who had fought her entire life to reach this moment. The woman behind the sunglasses, Adira Grant, was not just any driver, not just any civilian. She wasn't some random woman on the side of the road. In fact, she had spent years carving a path through the male-dominated world of law enforcement, enduring more than her share of obstacles, all while battling the weight of racial prejudice that threatened to keep her from climbing the ladder of success. But Adira never faltered. She couldn't afford to. Years before this encounter, Adira was a rookie officer, fresh out of the academy, filled with determination but also with the kind of naivety only someone new to the field could have. She had learned quickly that her presence, as a black woman in a predominantly white police force. What they didn't know yet was that this was their new chief, the woman who would soon be in charge of their every decision, their every move. But tonight, they were still clueless. And so far, they had no idea that this seemingly uneventful traffic stop was about to rewrite the entire narrative of their lives. Malik's hand hovered over his radio, but he hesitated. Something about this woman, about this situation, felt wrong. Normally, traffic stops went like clockwork, nothing to be concerned about, just the usual routine. But this was different. The woman hadn't shown any signs of fear, compliance, or even nervousness, all of which were standard in these types of encounters. She remained still, her face unreadable, her posture unyielding. Hughes stepped closer, trying to gauge her reactions, but the woman's calmness only deepened the sense of unease. It wasn't that she was doing anything overtly suspicious, it was the way she simply was, as if the whole world, including them, didn't quite matter. "Ma'am," Malik started again, forcing a slight smile, "can I see your license and registration?" The woman didn't immediately respond. Instead, she stared at him, her eyes sharp and unwavering. Malik shifted on his feet, waiting for her to comply. He had given her the benefit of the doubt so far, but this silence, this almost eerie stillness, was beginning to chip away at his patience. He exchanged a glance with Hughes, who was standing by the rear of the vehicle, his eyes narrowed. Then, without a word, the woman slowly reached into her glove compartment and pulled out her papers. She handed them over to Malik, her fingers brushing against his just briefly, but enough to make him pause, uncertain. The first thing Malik noticed as he glanced down at the documents was her name, Adira Grant. A name that meant nothing to him. But the longer he looked at her, the more he felt like he was missing something, like there was something much bigger than this simple traffic stop unfolding before him. "Do you have any idea why I pulled you over?" Malik asked, trying to steady his voice, hoping the conversation might help diffuse the growing tension. She looked at him as though the question was irrelevant, then answered with an unhurried tone, "No, I don't." "Your speed was a bit fast back there," Hughes chimed in from the rear of the car, his voice calm, but with an edge of concern. "Maybe you didn't realize." The woman's gaze shifted to Hughes now, and once again, there was that strange, almost unexplainable stillness. "I'm sure I didn't," she replied. Her voice didn't waver, and neither did her expression. Hughes paused, his eyes searching for a crack in her calm demeanor, but there was none. He shifted uncomfortably. He'd seen nervous drivers, hell, he'd dealt with plenty of hostile ones too, but never someone like this. Something wasn't right. Malik cleared his throat, trying to keep things in control. The night was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise still street. Officer Malik was in his patrol car, eyes scanning the road as he drove. It was just another evening shift, a time where the usual routine became almost mundane. That was until a dark sedan sped past him, its headlights cutting through the quiet night. Instinctively, Malik flicked on the sirens, the high-pitched sound echoing through the street as the car pulled over to the side. A routine traffic stop, no big deal. As he approached the vehicle, he noticed the driver, a woman, dressed in a sharp, tailored coat that seemed out of place for such a late hour. Her hands were calmly resting on the steering wheel, and her eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though it was well past sunset. "Good evening, ma'am." "License and registration, please," Malik said, his voice steady but the slightest hint of curiosity creeping in. The woman didn't respond right away, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different about the way she sat. Calm, poised, almost too calm. She slowly turned her head toward him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was an intensity in her gaze that made Malik pause for a split second, but he quickly shook it off, reminding himself that this was just another traffic stop. He wasn't here to play games. "Ma'am," he repeated, but the woman still didn't move to hand over any paperwork. Instead, she simply sat there, staring straight ahead. Malik glanced back at his partner, Officer Hughes, who was already standing near the back of the vehicle, scanning the area. Both of them felt a sense of unease as the silence stretched longer than it should have. Something wasn't right. Hughes, sensing the shift, approached the driver's side. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, trying to break the stillness in her presence. No response. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker, a coldness settling in. It was as if this woman wasn't reacting the way anyone should during a routine stop. Her lack of movement, her stillness, it was unnerving. Malik's instincts were telling him to be cautious, but there was no real reason to escalate anything. He had no reason to be suspicious, not yet anyway. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the car," Malik said, his voice a little firmer now. Still, no reaction. A growing unease gripped both officers. They exchanged a quick glance, and Hughes reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the woman finally moved. Slowly, she removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that held an undeniable authority, eyes that felt like they were seeing straight through them. "I'm afraid I can't do that," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, carrying a weight neither officer had been prepared for. It was then that Malik realized something. They had no idea who this woman was. No idea that she was about to change their lives in ways they couldn't possibly imagine.